turn it over to Miriam, I wanted to highlight some new programs that the Mental Health Matters team has initiated. So first of all, this class, the Sacred Balance class, so we have today and next week, 2 more times. We also have a divorce support group for women. Hear the echo, that's weird. Okay, there's an echo. And a new group that we're starting called Walk With Me, which is a support group for parents of teens and young adults who are struggling with mental health issues. This is a course that's going to begin November 2nd. And Deb O'Hare, back there, wave your hand, she's got all the details about that if you're interested, or if you know someone who might be interested. It's open to anyone, not just church family, but this is to be a support group to really help parents who are struggling with this kind of situation to share their experiences. And there'll be a therapist meeting with the group once a month to give support and some education. And then 2 more times in the month, the group will meet in a peer-led session. So please think about that. Spread the word if you happen to know somebody who might be interested. And then finally, through the grant that we received from the Coastlands Presbytery, we have established a counseling fund. So for people who are struggling to meet the expense of having counseling for family members, this counseling fund is available. So also information about that on the website. We also have, a letter went out, an email letter went out to the congregation with details about all of these things. If you didn't get that, if you'd like to see it on paper, we have printed out some copies. And they're with the book, which, I must say, is available. We have copies of Sacred Balance book, which Miriam is going to be talking about. Wonderful, wonderful book. You're free to borrow one if you want to take it and have a look. You can buy one for $15. Do we have change today?
No, an envelope at my house on my counter.
Oh, okay, but we know you're good for it. If you want to purchase it and bring us $15 later, that's fine too. All right, enough of me. Let me introduce Miriam again, Miriam Diephouse-McMillan, who has written this wonderful book. Take it away, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Allison. And it's great to hear about all these other ministries you guys are doing. I'm always curious about ways that churches are actively engaging mental health in their communities and supporting people. So that makes me really happy. It's great to hear great work that you guys are all doing. So this is week 2 of a 3-week series based on my book, Sacred Balance. Last week, for those who weren't with us last week, we really focused on 2 practices about developing our awareness of God, just becoming more aware of God in our lives. And we're going to continue from there. We talked a lot about intentionality, about kind of slowing down, about structured practices versus more flexible things that you can do throughout your day. The natural next step is like, okay, we know we're working on awareness of God. What do we do next, right? How do we respond to that awareness? When we start noticing God and spending time with God in our daily lives, what is our natural response? So I have 2 practices that I want to talk about today. These come from chapter 2 and chapter 8 of the book. And the first one, the daily examine, is a structured practice of reviewing your day with an eye towards where God is at work in your life. There's a chance to kind of observe the natural ups and downs of our experience with a prayerful lens. So how is God at work in the different things I'm feeling throughout my day, the different events of my day? There's a great article by a Jesuit priest, Father Dennis Ham, who calls the Daily Examen rummaging for God. And I love that image. He uses the image of a junk drawer, right? And there's that drawer we all have in our houses that's full of stuff, and there's the one thing you need, and you have to kind of like dig through. You know it's in there somewhere, but it takes a little work to find it. And he uses that analogy for the Daily Examen, that we know God is in our lives, but maybe it takes a little, digging to see how we can make sense of that, right? So I love that image for the Daily Examen. And I also describe it as this practice of daily reflection on the events of our lives with the goal of becoming more aware of God's Spirit at work. And I talked about this a little last week too. We know, we believe, we profess that God is active in our lives. And so this is a practice to help us figure out what that actually looks like, right? How do we actually engage that? The second practice is a practice of intentional gratitude. Frequently, when we become more aware of God in our lives, we have a natural response of appreciation and gratitude for the things that God is doing for us. And this is a practice of choosing to notice those moments of gratitude. And it's a very sensory-based practice, because a lot of the moments in our day when we feel joy, it's rooted in seeing something beautiful, or hearing a piece of music, or smelling the delicious food that's being cooked, right? We use our senses to enjoy the natural world that God created. And when we make that a practice of prayer, it becomes a prayer of gratitude. Just like when you walk into the kitchen and someone's cooking you something delicious and you're like, oh, that smells so good, thank you, right? You experience it, and the response is a response of gratitude. And so can we do that as a practice of gratitude in our lives? So gratitude is another one of these buzzwords in the mental health world, especially in the world of positive psychology. And so you hear gratitude journals and all these different gratitude practices. And it's one thing to just name things that we appreciate. It's another thing to direct that gratitude towards the Creator who made it for us, right? So we experience the good thing, and then we reflect and we bring God's presence into that as a way of prayer, of saying, thank you, God, for this moment. And we don't wait till later at the end of the day. We do it in the moment, when that beautiful thing is happening. When you go for a walk and you notice the color of the leaves and the blue sky, that moment is a prayer, right? It's intentional gratitude. So I describe it again as an act of celebrating the shimmering moments of pleasure that stand out amidst our daily grind. So taking those moments, hanging on to them, savoring them. And so the theme of both of these practices is that we're recognizing God in our lives, and that we naturally shift our response. That it shifts our perspective, it increases our gratitude, and it gives us some direction about what do we do next? How do we respond? So let's dig in a little to the history of these practices. The Daily Examen is rooted in the early church trying to figure out what is from God and what is not. And so we have these Bible verses that use language of discerning spirits. And sometimes we, mainline Protestants, we hear that and we're like, yeah, we don't really talk about spirits. That's not our thing, right? But in the early church, the language that's used in a lot of the early commentaries on these verses is not about like ethereal spirits in a woo-woo kind of way. It's about our own internal spirits. How do we discern our attitudes, our impulses, our thoughts, and sift through them and try to figure out which ones are in line with God's will and which ones are not? And so this whole practice of Christian discernment comes out of the desire to make sense of our internal experience. So then in the 16th century, Ignatius of Loyola, I mentioned him briefly last week, he is a Jesuit priest who wrote a book called The Spiritual Exercises, which is essentially a guide for spiritual development. He used it to train other priests, and it has been preserved to this day. I mentioned last week there are still people who go on Ignatian retreats that are based on the practices of this book from St. Ignatius. And one of the practices in his book is called the examination of conscience, and that is essentially what is now known as the Daily Examen. And when Ignatius talks about the Daily Examen, he encourages people to look for these two categories in our lives. One he calls consolation, and one he calls desolation. Consolation are those moments of connection, when we are aware of God's presence, when we feel connected to God, connected to people around us, A lot of times it's related to this sense of meaning and purpose and just feeling like, yes, this is the direction things are supposed to be going. Things feel right. Sometimes it involves positive emotions like joy and gratitude and thanksgiving, but not necessarily. Like we can all be in a really difficult spot and still feel like, okay, I know what I'm supposed to do here, right? I still feel connected to God even in this moment. So it's related to emotion, but it's not identical to positive emotions. Desolation, in contrast, is the opposite. It's any time when we feel disconnected. Disconnected from God, disconnected from people around us, maybe disconnected from ourselves and our values. It can be marked again by emotions of guilt, sadness, fear, but those emotions are not necessarily equivalent to consolation, right? I can feel sad and still feel connected to God. I can feel happy about something that I know doesn't align with God's will, right? So we can't exactly overlap our emotions to these spiritual states, but they can be indicators at times. As we're reviewing our day through this daily examine practice, we can use our emotions to give us kind of clues about what's pulling us closer to God, what might be pulling us away from God. And Ignatius is very clear when he teaches this practice that the goal is not to get rid of desolation, right? Most of us, and if you come from like a mental health, positive psychology, you're like, yeah, let's just have more consolation, right? How do we build more of that? Yes, of course, we want more consolation. We want to be connected. But he considers desolation to be an equally important part of our spiritual journey because there is information to be learned from both states. We can learn just as much about ourselves and about God from the times that we're disconnected as we can from the times that we're connected. So there's not an expectation that we're forever growing more and more consolation, but there's an expectation of personal reflection and learning from both states. And related to that, he describes this attitude of indifference, meaning non-judgmental observation of our experience. Can I notice what happened in my day without judging all of it as good or bad, right? Okay, this happened and I felt connected, and then this happened and I felt disconnected, without the sort of emotional attachment that we often bring to our evaluation of ourselves. That's very similar if you're familiar with mindfulness practices and this idea of non-judgment that gets taught in a lot of like mindfulness and yoga type practices, is observing your experience without judgment. Ignatius was talking about that in the 16th century, right? It's similar language, but this is the strand of that language that comes through our own Christian tradition. There's a verse here from Thessalonians, test everything and hold fast to what is good, right? So this idea of testing, of discerning, of looking at our lives through the lens of God and God's will for our lives, and using that to make decisions, right? And to hold on to the things that are good and to bring us closer to God. Similarly, prayerful savoring, the term prayerful savoring is my own term. It doesn't come from any particular history, but the history of gratitude is very much rooted throughout Scripture and throughout Christian tradition. It starts in the book of Genesis. In the first chapter of Genesis, every time God creates something, God pauses and says, this is good. And then we learn that we are created in the image of God. And so we too are invited to notice what is good, right? When we pause, when we connect to the good world that God has created for us, we are living into that image of God. That travels through Scripture, through the Psalms. There are Psalms we call them Psalms of wonder, these Psalms that are about the beauty of creation, about the wonderful things that God has created. And a lot of them, as you read these Psalms, have a lot of beautiful sensory language, right? It's about the sound of the thunder, or it's about the beauty of the mountains, right? Or the tambourines and the instruments, right? So it's all of these very concrete sensory awareness of this beautiful world that God created. And as we come into the New Testament and into our Christian heritage specifically, we have the act of communion, which in Greek is known as Eucharist, right? And the word Eucharist means thanksgiving. And so the act of communion, which is a sacrament, meaning it is a physical, tangible experience of God's presence with us. So again, sensory, tangible experience tied to the act of thanksgiving, right? When we come to the table and we receive the bread and the cup, it is an act of thanksgiving. It is us appreciating the way that God is physically nourishing us in that moment and bringing us into communion with God. And so can we bring that same attitude of Eucharist, that thanksgiving, into our other experiences throughout the day and find that moment of connection to God through these other practices of gratitude in our daily life. I will note that that takes a little bit of a shift for many of us. Many of us who are raised in Protestant traditions tend to have kind of a dualistic view of the world where like physical stuff is not so good and spiritual stuff is good, right? But the reason that we have sacraments is because we are physically embodied humans, right? God came to us in the physical form of a human man, right? Jesus is a physical person. And so we can experience God in these physical experiences. The joy, the sensory pleasure that we have throughout our day can be an act of prayer when we invite God into that, when we name that God is the one who gave us these beautiful things that we're experiencing. And so the well-known line from Psalm 34, taste and see that the Lord is good. So these two practices together, the daily examine and the prayerful savoring, shift us into reflecting on our lives from a spiritual perspective. We're reflecting, we're noticing what's going on with the daily examine. We're taking time to stop and think, and we're noticing where that comes from, right? The practice of gratitude is acknowledging that the things that are good about our lives come from God. And so it naturally leads us into that state of gratitude. So why would we do any of this, right? What are the mental health benefits? How does this actually help us, aside from being good spiritual practices? Both of these practices can help increase insight, this idea of self-awareness, of reflecting on our experience, on our own thoughts, on our emotions, on our actions. And when we do that, when we increase our self-awareness, it can help us make different choices. It gives us information about what we want to do more of and what we might want to do less of. It can help with decision making. A lot of people will use the daily examine practice for decision making. If you're trying to make an important decision about a career or a family decision or about moving, right? The daily examine can help us prepare for those decisions by giving us the information that we need. And similarly, gratitude can develop self-awareness as we start to notice, where are the moments in my life that I feel that shimmering, that I feel God's presence, right? And where I experience gratitude. And I can make choices based on that and try to build more of that into my life. These practices can also help us increase our sense of meaning and purpose. Meaning and purpose are increasingly being studied in the psychological field. They're often discussed in terms of resilience, that coping with really difficult things, coping with trauma, people who cope better are the ones who make meaning out of it, the ones who have a why for their ability to keep going. And so developing our own sense of meaning and purpose as it relates to our faith can give us resilience. It can help us cope better with whatever may be happening in our lives. And it can help us move forward in ways that are in line with those values and give us more of that sense of purpose. Reducing stress and negativity. This is related to what's known in the psychological field as the negativity bias. We all have a tendency to spend more time thinking about things that are going wrong than things that are going right. And from a practical, survival standpoint, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, I need to save my energy to solve problems. If it's not a problem, I don't need to think about it because it doesn't need to be solved. And if you think about evolutionarily, if I'm in the woods and I hear a stick breaking, it's going to be more advantageous to assume that's a predator than to assume it's just a squirrel, right? So our brains are wired to focus on the things that are negative, but that doesn't mean we have to live into that way of being all the time. I mentioned the field of positive psychology a few minutes ago. This is a whole field in psychology that has developed to try to help us balance that negativity bias by adding intentional positive values and virtues into our lives. And so when we use the daily examine and when we practice gratitude, we are fighting against that negativity bias. Because the examine, with that idea of indifference, right, without judging things as good or bad, gives us kind of a balanced perspective, right? We see what might not be going well, the problems that need to be solved, and we also see what's going well. We also look for consolation, right, not just the desolation. And then gratitude, of course, is this this positive experience of feeling connected and feeling thankful for the positive experiences that we're having. And there's a lot of studies that show that just noticing what we're grateful for increases our awareness of joy in the world. And so by practicing it intentionally, we are trying to balance out that negativity bias with some intentional awareness of the good that God has put in our lives. Recognizing support and connection. These practices help us become more aware of the ways that God is already supporting us. When we're going through something difficult, it can be really easy to focus on that negative, right? It's tied to that negativity bias. But awareness of support is also one of the key indicators of resilience and of positive coping, being a part of a community. This is one of the things I always say about what churches have to offer in our world today: community, support, being a part of a group of people who are supporting each other through whatever is going on. It's hard to find that in other places in our society today, to find real, rich support that's not just superficial. And I think churches are really good at it when they do it. And that's something that we can offer. And these practices help us become more aware of that support. Where is God helping me right now? What people has God put in my life to help me remember that I'm not alone? And my practices of gratitude can be social practices, right? Some of the moments that I use this prayerful savoring in the most are when I'm spending time with my kids. I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they are really good at this like awe and wonder, right? They're really good at savoring. You take them for a walk and they pick up a rock and they're like, "Mom, look at this rock." And I'm like, "It's just a rock," right? But they're so amazed by it. And their sense of wonder connects to my sense of wonder. And then I'm able to experience that gratitude in that moment as well. And so gratitude also helps us be connected to others, which relates to the next one about generosity. There are some cool psychology studies, but also brain scan studies about gratitude and generosity. That the part of our brain that lights up when we experience gratitude is the same part of our brain that lights up when we do something kind for someone else. So it's a natural social connector. When we express appreciation, we also feel connected to the people who are helping us and to God who's helping us. And it motivates us to then do things for others as well. And so there's this reciprocal relationship between gratitude and generosity. So obviously practicing gratitude is going to help that, but even the daily examine, even noticing what's going well in our lives can motivate us, because sometimes what we notice is that the times when we feel most connected and most of that consolation is when we are serving others, when we are doing things for the community around us. It helps us feel connected to God. And so it builds these social connections and builds our ability to express God's love in the world in these concrete ways to the people around us. And of course, because these are spiritual practices, we're also focused on how they help us spiritually. They give us the sense of fulfillment, by which I mean recognizing that what I'm doing and how I'm living is in line with what I believe, with my values, and with what God is doing in my life, right? That's really what that state of consolation is all about, is learning to align our daily lives more and more with God's Spirit at work in our world, and the sense of connection and fulfillment that we experience, that sense of integrity, right? I'm not just a person who says I believe these things. I am a person who lives this way. And that gives us that sense of groundedness in our faith and in what we believe, which can motivate us for continuing the work. You know, we all get tired. We all get burnt out, right? Trying to be the good person all the time. And practicing these intentional spiritual practices can help us stay connected to that awareness, which can give us the energy we need to keep going, even when it gets hard. I want to pause for a moment here and see if there are any questions. We are going to do a spiritual practice. We're going to do the daily examine together today. And that's going to take a little bit longer than the centering prayer took last week. So I want to pause for a few minutes first and see if there's any questions, any reactions to these two practices that I shared today.
Not so much a question, but what are these things up to God in their intention? because everything is rosy, everything is just the way you like it. Unfortunately, far too many of us forget about God. When we meet God, we experience these things that we think. And as far as the overall, how everything is defined, it wasn't until man got his two cents in. When they started to, that's where you had the strife between denominations and religions and all. Keep it simple. Just keep it, that's what God created. Keep it simple and just respect Him and enjoy your life.
Absolutely. So the focus on just coming back to God and recognizing that that's where all of these positive experiences come from.
Maybe you're going to talk about this next, if we're going to go through the exercise of examine. I'm wondering how private it is or how public. Is there some of both? And I'm asking because I think we have a tradition called confession, and I don't mean confession of faith, but confession of sin. So is examine something that you do within your own private world, or is it something that you share? Is it something you talk about with other people? It comes out of the Jesuit tradition, the Ignatian tradition. So how do they do that?
Great question. My short answer is both. It's both public and private. And in the history, in the tradition, the Ignatian tradition would often have like a spiritual advisor or a spiritual director, you'd meet with someone. And I actually have a chapter in the book about soul friends, the practice of having a spiritual accountability partner. And so having a person, you can have a trained spiritual director or just a person that you connect with, who you feel safe sharing some of these deeper personal aspects of your faith with. And so that would be the type of setting that traditionally the daily examine would be used, that someone, you would do the personal reflection on your own and then share that reflection. So maybe the spiritual director would assign you, do the daily examine every day for 30 days, and then come back and talk to me, right? So you're doing the work personally and reflecting, and then you're coming back and sharing with another person to get feedback, because part of the discernment tradition is that we don't just discern individually, we discern in community, right? And then, Richard brought up the piece of confession too, that when we notice that we are not in line with God's Spirit, what is the role of confession there, right? What is our responsibility to come to one another and say, look, I messed up, and I want to be welcomed back into this community and reminded of God's forgiveness through community. So I think there are ways that it can be done. Obviously, we always want to be mindful and careful about how much we're sharing in large group settings, right? That it's not necessarily appropriate to share our deepest concerns, spiritual or otherwise, in a public setting. But there are ways that we can learn from one another by sharing. This is where I really see God at work in my life. And then that, sparks a light bulb for somebody else, right? If the purpose of a lot of these practices is connection, then we need some of that connection to be a part of the practice as well. So it's both and. I think there's personal aspects of it, and then there's communal aspects as well.
So for the support group that we are starting for parents whose kids are struggling, we are going to be using your book as a guide, because I think most of the parents need to reduce stress and negativity. There's all of those positive things that we need to put into our lives. And so we will have the opportunity to meet together. And we have, Allison will be sort of teaching these practices to our group. And we'll be practicing together. And then we will be giving ourselves time to talk about it when necessary. So I'm interested to see how that is going to work out, whether, sharing. I thought last week, listening to how everyone practiced what we did, was everyone had sort of a little different take on it. And so you can sort of say, that didn't fit me, but this is how I want to do it. So looking forward to working through those practices.
Great, yeah. I think that's a wonderful model, especially for that sort of support group kind of structure, right? Is to teach the practices, go and engage them, and then come back and reflect together.
I really identify with trying to look at the positive and all of the beauty that can bring to my heart. And I'm curious if sitting with negativity is important too, and allowing yourself to really feel negative emotions or concentrate on negative things to sort of help yourself through.
I would say there's a difference between acknowledging negative emotions and dwelling in them. I think it's really important to acknowledge painful experiences and negative emotions and not avoid them. And I think sometimes the positive psychology world, I don't think they intend to do the avoidance, but it gets used that way, right? People want to just put a happy face on and pretend everything's fine, and meanwhile, like, you look at their knuckles and they're just like, ah, right? So we need to be real. And that's why I love that idea that Ignatius has of this indifference, right? That we can look at what's going on in our lives without needing to change it, right? I can be sad and just be sad. But that's different than I'm sad, so I'm going to watch a sad movie and listen to a sad song and eat a pint of Ben & Jerry's and wallow, right? Like, I don't need to dig into the sadness and make it bigger, right? So I want to acknowledge what's there and then make intentional choices about how to handle that and what do I need to heal from that and get through that. So I think it's a fine line to walk, because I think positive psychology can err on the side of like, let's just be happy all the time, which I don't think is how it's intended. It's intended to say, okay, let's sit with what's there, let's name it, let's be real about this world that we're living in and how hard it is, and let's make choices that bring out the joy, that bring out the gratitude, that bring connection, because that is how we move through those dark times.
Yeah, when you were talking about it, I was talking to my son about it. Like, I try to practice that intentionality too, because I find like we're always like looking for evidence for our beliefs, I feel like. So I feel like when I get into a negative mindset, then I'll say, like, if I'm feeling sad or anxious or something, then I'm immediately saying, like, why? Why am I feeling this way? Oh, because this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened, and kind of just like I'm giving myself that support for what I'm feeling. Versus if I'm looking at something from a positive standpoint, then I tend to kind of go the other direction and start to build a case for why I should be upset right now.
Yeah, and there's interesting research behind that the circuits in our brain for each emotion trigger themselves. So when I feel sad, my brain naturally looks for more things to keep the sad circuit running. And when I feel happy, it looks for more things that keep the happy circuit running. And so that awareness, that ability to step back and notice that happening and make a choice is really what these practices are trying to foster.
What mindfulness is really about is recognizing what sort of stuff you're just churning up in your head versus what's really worth worrying about. You know, if it's in the future, it hasn't happened, and it's like getting a song stuck in your head. You can't get rid of it. Your brain does that to you. And sometimes you can't fall asleep with these stupid conversations, you know? And I think mindfulness for me is just recognizing that's in your head.
Yeah, and there's a step in the way that I teach the daily examen that we're going to do in a moment. There's a step in which you have a moment to lift up something in prayer. So you've reflected through your whole day, and there's that one thing that's stuck in your head that you're going over and over. And so that's a piece of the practice, is to name that and then to lift it up to God and say, this is the thing I need the most help with today, God. And maybe you feel a sense of peace in that moment, or maybe you're just able to set it aside for a little while and trust that God can be at work, and when you come back a week later or a month later, you'll have a different perspective on it.
Brings us to leave it to God. We want to be in charge. We want to be able to control it. He makes it quite simple. Leave it to me. Footprints. That when we were in a sports position, that's when God was carrying us. So it all comes back to faith, accepting God offers us, and what He's shared with us in Scripture. Here's the secret.
And I think it's both and. That's part of it. A prayer that we use a lot at the hospital where I work is the Serenity Prayer. It's common in a lot of 12-step groups and a lot of recovery models, and it highlights both. It's the wisdom, I'm going to say it in the wrong order. The serenity to accept the things I cannot change, right? To lift up to God. These are things I don't have control over. But the courage to change the things I can. And then the key is the wisdom to know the difference, right? And that is discernment. That is a simple prayer of discernment, right? To say, this is what I can change and this is what I can't. And I have to know the difference so that I don't dwell on the ones I can't change, right? But not to give up on the ones I can, right? Not just to throw up my hands and say, it's up to you, God, I'm not going to do anything. It's about knowing where has God empowered me to act in my life and where am I invited to let go and to let God handle it, right? So discernment is always a both and trying to balance those things. All right, I would like to move into a time of daily examine practice. Allison, I'm going to task you with handing these out. This is an optional journal page. So the daily examine can be done completely in your head. If you're a person who likes to write and finds journaling beneficial, this is just a simple journal structure for that. If you're a visual person and you want to doodle your experience of this prayer, that's wonderful too. There's no wrong way to do it. I just like to offer people as many tools as possible because we all learn and grow in different ways. So this is a little more structured than the centering prayer that we did last weekend. So I'm going to be kind of talking you through the steps. But if you're a person who prefers to go at your own pace, again, just do that, right? I'm going to have the steps up here, and they are also phrased slightly differently on your handout. And the invitation is to engage this practice in whatever way you find meaningful. I'll go over the steps now just so you know where we're headed, and then I'll kind of walk you through them more prayerfully. The first step with almost any spiritual practice is intentionality, becoming aware of God's presence. So this is when we invite God into our time of prayer and remind ourselves that we are praying in this moment. It's also a time, if there's a question on your mind, if there's something that you are thinking about or that you're looking for wisdom about, you can name that to God before you start. Say, hey, God, I need to figure out this relationship in my life, and I would really like some wisdom about that. And then as you go through your day, you have that frame to help guide you. And then the bulk of the practice is reviewing your day with gratitude. It's almost as if you have like a video camera shot of your entire day for the past 24 hours, and you're just walking through it, but God is walking alongside you. So you're watching your day with God to see what's going on, noticing, again, these ideas of consolation and desolation. When does what you're doing feel in line with God and feel connected? And when did some events in your day feel a little disconnected? Noticing your emotions, again, with that non-judgmental idea, and considering how God might be speaking to you through your emotions. Then we have the step that I just mentioned about choosing one aspect of your day that you want to pray about. And then at the end, we take some time to kind of reflect on what this means going forward. What have I learned from this prayer, and how do I take that into my day tomorrow? So we're going to go ahead and begin. So I invite you to take a moment now to settle your body, to find a position where you feel grounded in your seat, and to notice God's presence here with us right now. Take a moment to invite God into your reflection. And lift up any concerns that might be on your heart today. Anything that you'd like wisdom for. Begin to invite God to walk through your previous day. Beginning with yesterday morning. First I got up, then I had breakfast. Just take this time to move through the events of your day. As you do this, take a moment to note to yourself or to write down on your journal page the moments you feel especially grateful for. The moments when you feel most connected to God in the last 24 hours.
exercise is really good. I think it decides what you're saying. It really makes you live every moment of your life. Like, I think once you reflect the next day, I think you'll live it different. You're much more in the moment, savoring. Thank you, that's all.
Absolutely. And we will have a little time for discussion at the end too, so feel free to share as things come up. So as you're noting down the moments of gratitude, the moments of connection, you can also take a moment to notice moments that felt especially challenging, moments when you felt isolated and disconnected. Again, noting them silently to yourself, writing them down, doodling, whatever way you feel helps you become more aware through this prayer. Continuing your focus on moving through your day with God. Also noticing any emotions that came up. Particular moments when you felt happy or sad, afraid, or angry. Simply reflecting on what that might be teaching you today. And just coming back to that review of your day. Sometimes you may find yourself moving back and forth between the moments of gratitude, consolation, and desolation, noticing emotions as you go. Just continuing to notice the events of your day and where God is at work. You may move through your day chronologically. You may find yourself jumping back and forth to different points. And as you're doing this, notice if there's one or two aspects of your day that you especially want to pray about today. These could be moments when you would like more wisdom. They can be a particular moment of gratitude that you want to lift up to God today. Just identify something specific and spend a moment in prayer, lifting that thing up to God. It's an opportunity to ask for guidance or to sit quietly and create space for new insights that God might be offering you. And there's no rush, but when you feel ready, take a few moments to reflect on what this prayer is teaching you as you look towards the day ahead. Are there changes that you would like to make in your day today based on this prayer? Any new insights or perspectives that you want to bring with you, hold on to? We'll take about 1 more minute to finish up this brief daily examine. Concluding our time of individual personal reflection and moving into a time of sharing with one another. So if there's anything from this prayer time that you feel comfortable sharing, any insights or reflection that you'd like to lift up, please do so.
I was friends last night. We were painting doormats for the season. It was really cute, but something that happened, a couple of the people that were there had young kids, and they mentioned recently how scared they were when the Lakehurst shooting, not shooting, but the threat came about, and they were terrified for their kids in school. And it opened my eyes to be like, wow, like, I mean, I don't have kids, but how can I help them, you know, or how can someone help them have peace and, you know, trust the school system that they know what they're doing in those situations. Had nothing to do with the school, but they were so frightened. And it just broke my heart, because I'm like, you live in this fear world. Like, they're like, oh, we're going to go to the school and pull them out myself. And I'm like, well, that's not how we do that. That wouldn't work. Like, let's be realistic, but also, like, how can I support as a friend? So that's what I've been asking to pray about and everything, because I don't know how to go about that situation.
Yeah, those moments of empathy, right? Connection with others and recognizing the struggles that others are going through. Yeah.
Anyone else have anything you'd like to share from your prayer practice today? So, step 4, choose an aspect to pray about. Is that one? Not necessarily. Okay. The idea is to
Not get overwhelmed with all the many things that we could pray about. But
that's what I feel like. I have so many. How do I choose? So I decided to choose one happy and one sad, because, you know, you have both. I mean, I want to celebrate what was good. I had some really positives in my day yesterday, and then I had some, you know, some stuff. So I think I'm going to maybe split that one into 2.
right? And again, these structures, these formats are tools. And so you find the ways to use them that benefit you, that help you grow in your own spiritual life and help you feel connected to God. And so if there's aspects that you adapt or change, I think that's wonderful.
I was just gonna say it was a good practice for me, because when I got to step 4, like choose an aspect to pray about, I wanted to ask God to do something to help me, and in even writing that down, like I instantly realized that He was already doing it. But it's funny, it's like sometimes you think because you don't feel like God is showing up in the way you want Him to in one area, you're just like, where are you? But then, like, if you actually take a minute, it's like, okay, well, you're here and here and here and here, and there are a million different ways you're supporting me right now. And so it was just even, I think, the practice of writing it down and confronting your own thoughts, because I think sometimes when they're like in your head, you don't give them enough of a challenge, like you don't confront them enough. Yeah.
And that's a beautiful example of this natural movement that happens when we become more aware of our lives, when we take time to reflect. It often shifts into awareness and gratitude for the ways that God is already there, right? That's how it helps us move from acknowledging what we're struggling with into I can also be grateful at the same time. It's beautiful.
So much of what people are saying says to me that your basic thing is to create a balance. To not be overwhelmed by negative, not be overwhelmed by doubt, and be overwhelmed by gratitude, but to strike a balance, because there is both in your day. And I used to always tell my daughter that if you don't have the downs, you can't appreciate the house. If everything was just copacetic all the time, you'd have no joy because you couldn't see the difference. Outside experience.
And just a couple, tips for using this practice. It is designed to be cumulative, meaning that you use this practice repeatedly over a certain amount of time. So the typical Ignatian structure is a 30-day retreat, where you would do this every day for 30 days. That may not be realistic for all of our lives. So be realistic with yourself. Use it, adapt it as you see fit. Maybe you do it on a weekly basis and you try to reflect back on your whole week. I don't have a great memory. It's really hard for me to remember a whole week at a time. So if I'm going to do it, I try to make it, maybe every day for a week and just see, because I'm at a time where I need to make an important decision and I want to be sure that I'm aware of where I'm in line with God in this decision. And so if I have a time when I really need it, maybe I'll do it every day for a week. Maybe it's I just had a really rough day and I want to use this to help shift my perspective a little bit, right? So it's very flexible in how you use it. Again, you can do it with the journal. You can just do it in your own head. You can do it as you're, laying in bed, kind of reflecting on your day. And, we talked about the thoughts that can come up at the end of the day when we're trying to sleep. Could you do this instead as a way to shift, your perspective as you're preparing to sleep? Or first thing in the morning, right? If you're a person who has a practice of, getting up and having a cup of coffee quietly by yourself, could you use that time to reflect on the previous day and set a goal for the day ahead based on this Ignatian structure?
Any other thoughts or
Questions?
Is there any benefit to doing it more than once a day, throughout your day?
I don't think there's any downside to doing it as often as you want. I think it's practicality, for me at least. I don't have that much time to sit and reflect every couple hours. So trying to find a time where I can just build it into my routine. I tend to be an end-of-the-day reflector kind of person. More in the morning, my brain doesn't work super well, so I tend to do it, at the end of the day. But you got to know yourself. You got to know what works for you. And then tips on the gratitude practice.
There are different ways if you
Want to practice prayerful savoring, to be intentional about that. I mean, you can do it without a lot of structure or intentionality, just noticing the good moments. But you can also be intentional about seeking out one thing with each of your 5 senses every day, right? I'm going to taste my coffee. I'm going to smell the flowers. I'm going to listen to my favorite song. I'm going to look at the beautiful sunset. And I'm going to wrap myself in a cozy blanket, right? And be intentional about building that sensory pleasure into your life. Or if there's a particular sense that really works for you, you can focus on that, right? I love listening to music, so I'm going to listen to my favorite song or different songs that I enjoy every day this week to try to build in that positive enjoyment and do it as an act of prayer. So there are some ways to make that a little more flexible and a little more adaptable as well. So I've said it before, I will keep saying it. These practices are tools. Use them as they serve you. Use them to connect to God. Use them to help yourself feel more grounded, more connected to God, and hopefully a little less stress or better able to cope with whatever the stress is in your life. Next week, we will be moving into, we've reflected on God's presence, we've reflected on our response to God's presence. Now we're going to move towards how do we expand beyond ourselves towards others in our lives. So we have a couple practices for that. One is called the loving kindness prayer, about offering prayers of love to people in expanding circles of our lives. And the other one is about a practice of pilgrimage and a sort of reframing of the practice of pilgrimage as I present it in the book. So that's what we'll be doing next week. There are flyers on the table next to the books for the event I'm doing on November 2nd at Allentown Presbyterian Church, which is focused on the brain science as it relates to some of these spiritual practices. So it's faith, the brain, and mental well-being. And I'm going to dig a little more into the research, some cool pictures of brain scans. So if you're interested in that stuff, it will be live streamed. You're welcome to join us in person in Pennington. It's at 3:30 on Sunday, November 2nd. But there's also a live stream, so you can just log on and watch it or go back and watch it later if you're not available at that time. So feel free to grab a flyer. It has the website on there and all the information. So feel free to grab that, and if you'd like a book, you can borrow a book or buy a book. And if not, I will see you next week. Either way.